A cold wind rolled across the dusty Texas field, carrying with it the smell of sage, leather, and wet fur. The Japanese women stood frozen along the fence line, their thin camp coats fluttering, eyes wide as a pack of muscular hounds strained against their leashes. They had expected rifles. They had braced for orders. Instead, a tall American cowboy stepped forward, boots cracking in the gravel, his voice calm beneath his hat. He held out a worn leather lead and motioned gently toward the dogs. Not for punishment, not for discipline, but for partnership. "Train them," he said. "Show them your hands aren't just for war." The women exchanged silent glances, disbelief tightening their throats. In Japan, they had tended wounds and buried the dead. Now, in the middle of enemy land, they were being invited to shape living creatures with care instead of destruction. The hounds barked, not in rage, but in anticipation. And for the first time since surrender, something inside the women stirred. Not fear, not obedience, but a fragile, terrifying curiosity. The first morning inside the American camp arrived without violence. No shouted orders tore through the air. No rifle butts struck the ground for attention. Only the distant creak of a watchtower ladder and the low wind sliding across the open plains. For Iko, who had once woken to artillery, to men screaming through smoke, to the hard slap of boots in field hospitals collapsing under blood and heat, the silence itself felt like a weapon. It pressed against her ears, heavy and wrong, as if the world had forgotten how to be cruel. She sat on the edge of her narrow cot, fingertips resting on her knees, feeling the unfamiliar give of a straw mattress beneath her weight. Even that felt obscene. Softness had no place in the world she had come from. They had arrived in the night, the trucks rolling through darkness like foreign beasts, headlights cutting narrow tunnels through the dust. She remembered gripping the edge of the wooden bench as the vehicle slowed, her jaw clenched so tightly her teeth ached. All along the ride she had been waiting for the moment the illusion of restraint would disappear and cruelty would take its place. But when the tailgate dropped, it was not cruelty that greeted them. It was quiet. A guard had gestured with an open hand. Another had handed them canteens. The absence of rage unsettled her more than any blow would have. In the yard now, the other women stood in small, uncertain clusters, their thin camp coats brushing against each other, eyes scanning for threats that never came. Some whispered prayers under their breath. Others stared straight ahead, faces carved from exhaustion and stubborn pride. Aiko saw remnants of the people they had been. Nurses, messengers, clerks, daughters. Each one had carried a different version of the same myth. That capture meant dishonor. That surrender erased the soul. That the enemy would shred whatever dignity remained. That death would have been cleaner. Her own body still carried the language of that belief. When a guard passed too close, her shoulders tightened instinctively. When boots crunched on gravel behind her, her breath snagged in her throat. She had spent years watching men collapse under the weight of impossible orders, had stitched skin torn by shrapnel with hands that never shook even as her insides did. She had seen officers strike wounded boys for failing to stand straight. Discipline, they had called it. Honor. Suffering as proof of loyalty. Now she stood in a place where suffering seemed suspended, and the suspension felt like a trap waiting to spring. The camp itself was almost offensively organized. Barracks lined in clean rows, a mess hall with smoke curling lazily from its chimney, buckets of water set neatly beside wash stations. There was no chaos, no frantic scrambling for rations or shelter. The order was calm, deliberate. It made her uneasy. Order back home had always been enforced with fear. Here it seemed to exist without it. Then she saw them, figures, approaching from the far end of the compound, moving with a slow, measured confidence that did not match the stiffness of soldiers. Men in wide-brimmed hats, their silhouettes cut against the pale sky, boots scuffed with dust instead of polish. They did not march. They walked, unhurried, as if this ground belonged to them long before any war had touched it. Alongside them rolled two large trucks, their metal sides marked with faded military insignia, and behind the trucks came the sound that froze the field. Barking. Not the sharp, hysterical barking of half-starved strays that prowled bombed cities, but deep, full-throated sounds that vibrated in the chest. Controlled, alive. The dogs had not yet come into view, but Aiko felt their presence before she saw them, like an approaching storm pressing against the air. Her fingers curled into her palms without her noticing. The women shifted, unease rippling through the line. Dogs had meant danger in wartime, detection, death. They were used to track soldiers through forests, to patrol perimeters, to signal that the enemy was near. Aiko had once watched a wounded man dragged from his hiding place after a dog caught his scent. The memory still clung to her like damp cloth. And yet these men did not hold rifles. They held leashes, coiled casually in their hands. Their faces were sun-worn, unreadable, but not hostile. One of them tipped his hat slightly as he approached the camp command tent, exchanging a few words with an officer. Aiko could not hear what was said, only the low hum of voices blending with the restless sound of animals. And as the first hound leapt down from the back of the truck, shaking dust from its coat under the wide American sky, the fragile curiosity she had felt tightened into something sharper. Not fear, not hope, but the sense that her life had just turned onto a road she had never been taught to recognize. The dogs hit the ground with a sound like soft thunder, paws sinking into dry soil, muscles rippling beneath coats brushed clean of mud. They were not mutts. They were built, shaped, bred for purpose. German shepherds, massive and alert, their ears cutting into the air as though listening to something beyond the camp, beyond the war itself. Their handlers spoke low, steady words that carried no threat, only familiarity. Aiko's nose caught the scent before anything else, leather worn smooth by hands and sun, sweat mixed with animal warmth, a trace of oil from the truck's metal sides. It was a smell she did not know, but one that stuck instantly to memory, as if her mind understood the significance long before her heart did. Around her the women stiffened, shoulders drew up, backs straightened. For many of them, dogs were not companions but instruments of terror. In the final retreats across burned villages and jungle ground, dogs had meant detection, pursuit, exposure. They had barked when men tried to hide beneath roots or ruined walls. They had been used to break silence the way artillery broke stone. Aiko remembered one stationed near a coastal encampment, trained to maul anyone who wandered too close to guarded supplies. She had never gone within 10 paces of it. No one did, unless ordered. Now here they stood again, but something was wrong. The dogs did not snarl. They did not lunge. Their eyes moved across the yard with sharp focus, but without malice. When one of them strained at his leash, it was not toward the women in aggression, but in curiosity. His tail did not whip in rage. It flicked once, then again. Aiko felt the moment lodge uncomfortable inside her chest. The handlers did not posture. They did not tighten their grips as if expecting an attack. Instead, one crouched and ran his hand along the back of a dog, speaking to him the way a person speaks to a stubborn child. Calm, familiar, almost affectionate. The word sit rolled from his mouth, gentle but firm. The dog obeyed without hesitation, his heavy body folding into stillness. It was the opposite of what they had been taught to expect. In Japan, animals used for military purposes were tools like stretchers or syringes. They were not addressed. They were commanded or discarded. Here, the men spoke to them softly, as if the dogs held some private dignity. The women watched in silence, their eyes following every movement. Some took small steps back, as though distance alone could protect them from old memories. Others couldn't look away. Aiko noticed her own hands had curled into fists. She slowly forced her fingers open, aware of the tremor in her fingertips. The handlers began walking the dogs along the fence, letting them adjust to the environment. The hounds pulled occasionally, noses low, tails stiff, calculating the new terrain. One stopped near the line of women and lifted his head. His eyes met Aiko's. She did not move. The moment was unbearable in its stillness. Not a stare of threat, not of dominance, but something untranslatable. A presence recognizing another presence. He sniffed the air, took a cautious step forward, then sat again as his handler gently adjusted the leash. No growl, no bark, only breath. A murmur rippled through the women. "Why do they look at us like that?" No one answered. The American officer overseeing the camp stood a short distance away, arms crossed, observing the scene with skeptical detachment. His expression was not cruel, merely uncertain. These dogs had been trained for patrol and security to support American units overseas, but delayed redeployment had brought them here instead. Temporary placement, temporary purpose, nothing more. And yet, as one of the handlers guided a hound past the women again, slowing deliberately this time, Aiko noticed something else. The leash loosened slightly. Just a little. The dog turned his head again. This time he stepped closer. Not toward the handler, toward them. The moment lingered, suspended between instinct and reason, until a calm, weathered voice cut through the quiet. Not barked like an order, but carried with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime around things that didn't respond to fear. It belonged to the oldest of the handlers, a man whose hair had gone thin and gray long before the war had ended, whose skin had been darkened not by smoke but by years beneath open sky. The way he watched the women was not curious and not cold. It was deliberate. He had been studying them since morning, not for their defeat, but for their hands. He had seen them in the infirmary tent, fingers steady as they cleaned infected wounds with near-empty supplies, movements precise, even when their own bodies trembled with fatigue. He had seen them in the kitchen, slicing vegetables with discipline, not speed, every motion economical, controlled, without waste. Their coordination was not the obedience of soldiers awaiting orders. It was the quiet discipline of people who had learned that survival depended on precision when everything else had dissolved. He turned to the camp officer beside him, a man who still viewed the prisoners as a problem to manage, a body count to house until repatriation. The handler spoke low, not with sentiment but with practicality, explaining that these women possessed the kind of calm presence animals responded to, that dogs trained for war required steady energy, not domination, that hands used to holding scalpels and bandages understood restraint better than fists or shouting ever could. The officer's expression tightened. These were enemy personnel, he reminded him. Former auxiliaries of a military that had cost American lives. Giving them access to military animals was not just irregular, it bordered on foolish. It could damage morale. It could backfire. It could be seen as softness. The handler did not argue it as mercy. He argued it as function, resources delayed by transport. Dogs stressed from unfamiliar climates, men exhausted from duty cycles that never ended. Stress in animals, he said, shadows the stress in people, and calm hands can neutralize both. He pointed subtly toward the women, who stood still along the fence line like figures carved from winter air. "They are not looking for power," he added. "They already lost it. That makes them dangerous in a different way, or useful." The officer watched them in silence, measuring something in his own mind that had nothing to do with regulations anymore. War had already rewritten most rules. One more fracture was just another aftershock. He finally agreed, though his jaw remained tight, though his shoulders remained rigid. Limited participation, supervised sessions, no unsanctioned contact, a trial, nothing more. Word spread through the yard, carried through a translator whose voice trembled not with fear but uncertainty. A project, he explained, temporary, optional. Assistance needed with the camp dogs, not as cleaners, not as patrol substitutes, as assistants in behavioral and handling procedures. The word voluntary hung strangely in the air. Many of the women had not heard it used sincerely since before the war ever began. A murmur spread. Some backs straightened. Others leaned away as if distance itself could protect them. For years they had survived by obeying without thinking. Now they were being asked to choose, and the unfamiliarity of choice unsettled them more than command ever had. Aiko did not move. She kept her gaze steady on the hound, who still lingered slightly forward from the others, his body relaxed but alert, his breathing slow, his posture unforced. He was not straining to get close. He was simply present, as though he already existed in a world where fear was not the first language. The handler noticed her stillness, followed her line of sight, and something in his expression softened, not with sympathy but with recognition. He lifted his hand, slowly, and gestured toward her not as one gestures to a subordinate, but as one invites a hesitant collaborator. No sharpness, no pressure, only space. And in that space, Aiko felt something unfamiliar tightening inside her. Not fear, not duty, but the recognition that for the first time since surrender, no one was demanding her submission. They were asking for her hands. The training yard had been cleared of unnecessary clutter, leaving nothing but packed earth, a few low wooden posts, and a wide stretch of open ground where dust lifted and settled with every cautious movement. The sky hung vast and merciless above, yet the women never truly raised their eyes to it, their gazes trained lower by years of conditioning. Aiko stood near the edge of the group, her arms resting rigid against her sides, not in defiance, but to hold back the tremor she felt threatening to surface. The dogs stood closer now, no longer distant shapes, but living, breathing bodies tethered to worn leather straps. Their smell filled the air, warm fur mixed with dust and sun, a scent that felt foreign and intimate at once. Beneath the dry heat, fear tightened around her chest like an invisible cord. The handler's voice broke the stillness, low and even, translated gently into Japanese. No sudden movements, no shouting. Hands open, palms downward first. Let them approach. His tone carried no force, only repetition, as if these instructions had always been meant for frightened hearts and not just trained animals. The women listened silently, their instincts screaming caution. Aiko felt the old terror surface in her muscles, the memory of dogs roaring through jungle brush, used as weapons, released to find and destroy. These were symbols of pursuit, of exposure, of death. Yet the animal before her now did not snarl. It did not bare its teeth. Its chest rose and fell slowly as it observed her. The first dog was led forward, his coat reflecting dull sunlight, his movements deliberate. The handler's grip on the leash was relaxed, not commanding. He allowed the hound to see them, to smell them, to decide his distance. This unforced space unsettled her more than restraint ever could. In her world, control had always come through tightening, through pressure. Here, control seemed to grow through release. A quiet command drifted from the handler. "Sit." The dog responded instantly, settling into position without stiffness, his muscles relaxing into obedience untainted by fear. Something about that unsettled Iko. This animal had been shaped through discipline, but not broken by it. There was a difference, and she suddenly understood how rare it was. Her feet moved before she fully realized. The dirt shifted under her soles as she stepped forward. She heard whispers, but they blurred at the edges of her awareness. All she saw was the space between her hand and the dog's head. All she felt was the war inside her chest, slowing to a cautious stillness. The handler watched, alert but non-interfering. He did not shout. He did not command. He observed her the way a doctor observes a pulse. Aiko raised her hand slowly, the movement not driven by bravery but by necessity. Her fingers hovered just above his fur, waiting for instinct to trigger retreat. But it did not. Her hand settled against his head, warm and coarse beneath her palm. The warmth startled her. Not heat, life. The dog remained still. His ears softened. She expected to pull away, to feel the old terror clamp shut around her nerves. Instead, her hand stayed. She let it stay. She felt his breath, his stillness, the steady reality of another living being who did not care about nations, uniforms, or propaganda. He recognized only presence. The handler instructed quietly again, guiding her through repetition. Touch, withdraw, touch, withdraw. Each time, the distance between fear and action shortened. Each time, the wall inside her loosened. The other women followed, hesitant at first, then gradually. One by one, hands once used to carry stretchers, hold scalpels, or steady dying bodies reached toward something that did not bleed or curse or die under their care. The dogs accepted them without judgment. Animals did not understand ideology. They did not honor empires or obey political myths. They responded to voice, to scent, to intention. And as Aiko stood there, her palm resting calmly on the creature's head, she realized she had stepped into a moment where she was neither prisoner nor enemy. She was simply a caretaker again, even if only for a breath. And for the first time since surrender, her hands did not shatter under the weight of gentleness. The days that followed settled into a rhythm no one had imagined possible when the trucks first rolled through the gate. Morning light broke across the yard, and with it came the dogs, their bodies stretching and shaking off sleep, as the women filed out with bowls, brushes, and folded cloths. Feeding became the first ritual. Tin buckets filled with kibble and scraps were carried carefully across the dirt, hands steady now, not from training alone, but from familiarity. Aiko learned how each hound ate, how one preferred his food in slow, measured bites, while another devoured his in restless bursts, as if afraid it might be taken away. Cleaning followed, brushing fur clogged with dust and loose hair, the movements no longer hesitant. They spoke softly now, not because they had been ordered to, but because noise startled the animals. In their quiet care echoed the same gentleness they had once used over wounded bodies, only this time the bodies did not break. While the present unfolded in repetitive calm, the past came crowding back in fragments. The smell of warm fur sometimes shifted in her mind into the stench of blood and damp soil from island field tents. The rasp of a dog's breath would dissolve into the memory of soldiers gasping under morphine. She remembered jungles where leaves rotted under constant rain, where dogs were used to flush starving men from the undergrowth, where barking meant exposure, capture, humiliation. She remembered being told that American animals were trained to tear flesh with pleasure, that they reflected the savage nature of their masters. Yet here, these same forms rested obediently against her leg while she cleaned their paws, their eyes half closed in contentment. The contrast felt unreal, like two incompatible lives stitched awkwardly together. The cowboy handlers rarely spoke. They moved through the space with economy, their boots scuffing dust, their hats tilted low against the sun. When they corrected a movement, it was with gesture more than voice. A nod when something was done right, a slight shake of the head when it was not. Their silence was not dismissive. It carried weight, a kind of acknowledgment that did not demand response. Aiko began to notice small things. How one handler always held the gate open a second longer to make sure no one brushed the metal edge. How another handed her a fresh cloth when her own was soaked without looking directly at her. Respect existed here, not as language, but as space given without hostility. The dogs responded to that space as well. Training sessions lengthened as the days passed. Simple commands became layered routines. Sit, stay, heel, recall. The women repeated the words as the handlers taught them, foreign syllables shaping their mouths as just tools, not declarations. The dogs learned their tones quickly. They responded not to accent, but to intention. Each successful response felt like a small crack in the rigid image of the enemy that had been carved into their minds. At night, when the yard stilled and the animals settled into soft, low breathing, memories returned more sharply. Some women cried into their blankets, remembering brothers who never came home, mothers who bowed before radio announcements that promised glory while delivering only loss. Others stared at dark rafters, haunted by officers who had spoken of honor while striking them for weakness. Aiko lay awake, her hands still faintly smelling of animal fur and soap, and wondered when the word enemy had begun to lose its certainty. Because the men who walked these grounds, who taught them with gestures instead of threats, who trusted them with living creatures after all that had been lost, did not look like monsters. They looked tired. They looked measured. They looked careful. The absence of cruelty felt heavier than cruelty itself, because it forced the women to confront a possibility they had never been allowed to imagine. That kindness could exist without strategy. That respect did not require surrender of self. Each morning, as Aiko stepped into the dust with bowls in her hands and dogs circling her legs, she felt the slow unraveling of a thing she had once guarded fiercely. Not her loyalty, but her certainty. And it was that uncertainty, more than any barbed wire, that began reshaping who she had become. It did not come softly. It did not come with gratitude or clarity. It came at night, in the space between exhaustion and sleep, when the dogs had settled and the camp had fallen into its uneasy quiet. Aiko lay on her cot with her hands folded over her chest, still carrying the faint scent of fur and disinfectant, and wondered if comfort was a kind of betrayal. Each day she learned the rhythm of care, the way to calm a restless animal with tone rather than force, the way to anticipate a hound's movement before it happened. Each day her body grew steadier, her hands surer, and each night guilt crawled back into her thoughts like a slow, patient shadow. She imagined her mother in Osaka, standing in a line that stretched for hours, clutching a cracked metal bowl, hoping for rice that might never come. She imagined neighbors boiling water with roots scraped from ruined earth. She imagined her younger brother, if he was still alive, walking through streets gutted by firestorms, his stomach shrinking around itself. She could not know if any of it was true. She could not know if any of them still existed at all. But uncertainty did not soften the image. It sharpened it. And here she was, allowed to touch dogs trained for war with gentle hands, given food that did not taste of dust or despair, surrounded by fields untouched by flame. The contrast made her stomach tighten. The more the camp rewarded her quiet cooperation, the more she questioned what it was costing somewhere else. Survival had once meant obeying without thought. Now it demanded something more dangerous: thinking. Some accepted the strange peace with weary relief. They told themselves that endurance took many forms, that to stay alive, to stay whole, was not betrayal, but duty of a different kind. Others could not bear that notion. One woman, a former communications clerk from Yokohama, stopped attending the training sessions altogether. On the fourth morning, her place in the yard remained empty. The dogs shifted restlessly, sensing absence. The women avoided looking at one another. She locked herself in silence, refusing meals some days, refusing even to touch the soap provided in the washhouse. When a guard approached to encourage her return, she turned her face away. Later, in a whisper that carried through the barracks like a wound, she spoke. "Every time you touch them, you touch the hands of those who burned our cities. Every time you smile, you erase the pain of those who died. This is not kindness, this is forgetting." Her words lingered long after she fell silent. Aiko felt them settle into her chest like nails. She did not know how to remove them. She only knew that when she stepped back into the yard, when the dogs recognized her and their tails moved in quiet arcs, she felt two worlds fighting inside her ribs. One world where compassion was weakness, another where compassion was the only thing that hadn't been turned into ash. The handlers noticed the change, though they never mentioned it. Their silence, which once felt like distance, now carried something else, a restraint, as if they understood more than they allowed themselves to say. They did not fill the space with words. They let it exist, heavy, unbroken. One afternoon, during a longer session, Aiko caught the older handler watching her longer than usual. His eyes had the look of men who had seen too much and chosen to hold what remained carefully. He said nothing. He only nodded, almost imperceptibly, when she guided one of the younger dogs through a sequence of commands without breaking her composure. She wondered, not for the first time, if his silence hid guilt or understanding. The dogs, ignorant of these human fractures, carried on with their simple certainty. They did not know nations. They did not recognize flags or burned coastlines. They responded only to presence, to tone, to consistency. And when they rested their weight against Aiko's legs after training, seeking the familiar reassurance of hands that did not strike, she felt a relief that came instantly and shame that followed just as fast, because back home, relief was a luxury no one could afford. And here it was being offered daily, without demand. The war for Aiko was no longer in guns or uniforms. It had moved inward into memory and conscience, into a space no camp fence could contain. And the most painful truth of all was this: the enemy she had been taught to resist was slowly being replaced by a far more dangerous opponent. The part of herself that wanted to believe in kindness. The day of the demonstration arrived without ceremony, marked only by the unusual presence of unfamiliar boots along the edges of the yard and a subtle tightening in the way the handlers fastened their gloves. American officers had been summoned from nearby training posts, men whose uniforms still carried the crispness of supply lines, untouched by defeat. They stood in a loose semicircle, faces unreadable, eyes scanning the space, not as a place of rehabilitation, but as a testing ground. The dogs sensed the shift immediately. Their ears lifted, their bodies aligned, the air thick with a tension that was not fear, but expectation. Aiko stood with the other women at the field's edge, her spine straight, her hands folded calmly before her, trying not to listen to the echo of her own heartbeat. The handler stepped forward and spoke in the same low register that never betrayed urgency. He gestured toward the women rather than the men beside him, and there was a flicker of surprise among the officers, so small it could be missed by those who did not know how to read doubt in shoulders and jawlines. The demonstration began simply, with basic commands: sit, stay, recall. The dogs obeyed, but without the sharp precision they showed during routine sessions. Their movements were mechanical, not wrong, but not alive either. The officers nodded to one another, already forming conclusions, as if this display were only confirming what they expected. Then the handler stepped back and motioned toward the women. Aiko felt her breath pause. One by one they walked forward, not with pride, but with the same careful gravity they had used when approaching wounded soldiers. The dogs shifted, their posture changing, their attention sharpening in a way that no command could cause. Aiko lifted her hand slowly and spoke the same words she had practiced in a foreign tongue. Sit. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The dog in front of her obeyed instantly, not stiffly, but fluidly, settling into position with a familiarity that bordered on comfort. The sound of it, the soft movement of fur against dust, traveled through the field more clearly than any applause. Stay. The dog's gaze did not leave her. A ripple moved through the officers, subtle and involuntary. Their attention sharpened, their posture shifted. One by one, the women repeated the routines. Heel, turn, recall. The dogs responded with precision, sharpened by trust rather than command. Their tails flicked, not as signs of submission, but of recognition. To the untrained eye, it might have appeared as nothing more than successful instruction. But for those who understood control, who had built their world on rigid hierarchies and defined enemies, something else was happening. The dogs were not responding to authority. They were responding to presence. Silence settled heavily around the yard. When the handlers attempted to take over again, issuing the same commands with identical wording, the animals complied, but their attentiveness dulled. Something had shifted, not in their training, but in their allegiance to what felt steady. The officers began to look at the women differently, not as defeated auxiliaries, not as remnants of an enemy force. Their gazes lost the edge of abstraction. They saw steadiness instead. The kind of steadiness that did not come from rank or nationality, but from the ability to remain composed when history stripped everything else away. For Aiko and the others, the moment unfolded as quietly as morning light, but its meaning cut deeper than any announcement. For the first time since they had stepped onto American soil, their worth was not measured by what nation they had served, nor by which side of surrender they stood on. It was measured by how they held their hands, how they used their voices, how they stood in silence without hardening. She did not feel pride. She felt a new kind of weight, one that demanded responsibility rather than defense. Because in that moment, as the dogs circled their legs and the officers lowered their gazes in silent reconsideration, Aiko realized that loyalty had shifted shape. It was no longer bound to flags or orders. It had begun to tie itself to something smaller and much harder to betray: her own humanity. The dogs no longer hesitated. They came when called, their eyes following the women's hands, their ears tilting in the direction of soft words rather than harsh commands. Aiko had not expected this change. She had not expected to see the dogs responding to the women with the same steady certainty that had taken root in her own body. Each morning, as the sun painted the earth with its slow, golden light, the dogs followed them as if they had always belonged by their side. their movements no longer measured by discipline, but by quiet trust. The women spoke to them not with authority, but with patience, each word spoken gently, as though the dogs were no different than the patients they had once tended to in their hospitals, fragile yet alive, waiting to be cared for. Aiko noticed the transformation most on the dog she had worked with the most, a large shepherd whose fur had started to shine more every day. His response to her now was instinctive, his eyes tracking her every move, his body folding easily into positions she had once thought were reserved only for soldiers trained for obedience. He did not act out of fear or training. He acted because she had shown him a steadiness he had learned to follow. When Aiko's hand touched his head, there was no apprehension. His calm was a mirror of hers. It wasn't just obedience, it was a mutual trust built from the ground up, not through fear, but through repetition and care. One afternoon, after a particularly quiet session, one of the handlers approached Aiko, his face unreadable. He paused before speaking, as though he, too, was still working out what he had just witnessed. He admitted, in a voice so low only she could hear, that he had never seen dogs respond like this. He had worked with hundreds of animals in different parts of the world, had trained dogs for patrol, for rescue, for war. But these animals, these dogs, had never connected like this before. They had always been tools, instruments of force. They had never followed a person, not because of rank or command, but because of their presence. The silence that followed his admission settled heavily in the air. For Aiko, his words did not bring pride, but a strange ache in her chest, a mixture of grief and relief, because, in truth, she had never expected to find peace in this place. She had never expected to feel so close to something she had once seen as an enemy, something whose very presence had filled her with terror. Yet here she stood, surrounded by animals whose loyalty was no longer measured by force, and men whose respect had not been won by anything other than quiet consistency. She had come to this camp thinking survival meant endurance and that surrender meant loss. But survival, she now understood, meant learning to give and take in ways she had never been taught, and surrender had nothing to do with submission. The other women moved through the days in the same quiet rhythm, tending to the dogs, not with pride, but with a kind of reverence. They did not speak of it. They did not discuss it as a victory. There were no loud cheers or celebrations. Instead, they passed each other with brief, shared glances of understanding, of something deeply transformative unfolding, but not fully grasped. There were no words to explain it. They had been so used to being taught through violence and compliance that they had forgotten what it was like to learn through trust. In this quiet, tentative partnership, the women began to understand that their value was no longer bound to the violence they had once known. It was not their ability to endure pain or to take orders. It was their capacity for quiet, for understanding the world in ways their captors had never expected. It was the ability to find calm in a storm, not by running from it, but by standing firm in its center. In this silence, the women began to awaken, not to the promises of the war they had left behind, but to the possibilities of the lives they might rebuild. If you're moved by this story so far, don't forget to like the video and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from around the world. Your voice keeps these stories alive. It came quietly, as everything else in the camp had. A single message delivered by the camp commander, his voice devoid of ceremony, as though even the idea of finality had become an afterthought. The war was officially over. The enemy had been defeated. The repatriation process would begin within days. The words hung in the air, not as relief, but as something colder. For the women, it was not freedom that awaited them, but uncertainty. They had been prisoners of war for so long that the very concept of returning to a life that wasn't defined by barbed wire, patrols, and the distant echoes of gunfire felt unreal. The idea of home was a concept as foreign to them now as it had been to the men who had fought in the trenches. They could not go back to a life that had been shattered, and yet they would. The days leading up to their departure felt like a final countdown to an unknown future. They moved through them mechanically, their actions more routine than expected. Breakfast, work, evening. All the while, the shadow of goodbye loomed, and none of them knew how to face it. As the women walked the familiar paths of the camp one last time, each step felt heavier than the last. They had grown accustomed to the small order of their lives here, the slow rhythm of the dogs' training, the quiet exchanges with the handlers. These small moments of routine had become anchors in a sea of uncertainty, and now they were being torn away, leaving the women to float in the uncharted waters of a life that seemed too distant to remember. The last days with the dogs were filled with a quiet sorrow that none of the women could express in words. They had been asked to care for these animals, to guide them, to learn with them, to grow alongside them. And now, in the last moments of their time together, they were being asked to let go. No ceremony, no final words, just the inevitable distance that would come with their departure. Iko spent her last day in the yard with the shepherd that had followed her from the very beginning. He had become her shadow, the one constant in a life filled with temporary moments. His coat was softer now, his movements smoother, no longer driven by the chaos of war, but by the calm he had learned in her care. She stood with him for a long time, her hand brushing against his fur as though memorizing the sensation. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no final expressions of gratitude, just a steady exchange of presence, the last moment of connection before they were forced to separate. The camp, once a place of isolation, had become a strange sanctuary. The dogs, the handlers, the routine had all woven themselves into the fabric of their daily lives, and now that fabric was being unraveled. The unspoken cost of this separation was not the loss of a home or a place, but the quiet fracture of a bond that had been forged in survival. The dogs had been their companions, their co-conspirators in a world that had given them little else, and now they were being left behind, just as the women had once left behind the world they knew. As Iko stepped onto the transport truck that would carry them toward the unknown, she glanced back one last time. The camp receded behind her, a blur of dust and memory. She didn't know what would await her when she returned home. Would the world still be broken? Would she find the people she had left behind? But in that final glance, she understood something. The dogs had taught her that survival didn't always mean enduring. Sometimes survival meant learning how to let go. And for the first time since the war began, Aiko felt the weight of both loss and freedom settling on her shoulders, unspoken but undeniable. Years later, in the quiet corners of her life back in Japan, Aiko would remember the dogs more clearly than the war. Not the wire that had held her captive, not the guards who had watched her with indifferent eyes, not the rubble of cities reduced to ash under the endless bombardment. No, those images had faded into something distant, as though they had belonged to another lifetime, another person. The memories that lingered were of warm fur against her palm, of the dogs that had followed her across the training yard with a trust that she had never imagined would exist between enemy and prisoner. When Aiko closed her eyes, it was not the sound of rifle fire that echoed in her ears, but the soft thud of paws against dirt, the rhythmic breath of a dog at her side, and the slow, quiet moments of care that had tethered her to something human again. Life in post-war Japan was a strange, muted version of what it had been before. The country was still broken, cities still scarred by bomb craters, homes turned to skeletons of what they had once been. There was no immediate rush of comfort, no ease in returning to the life they had once known. Many of the women who had returned with Aiko carried their own scars, some visible, some not. For some, the memories of the camp were still too fresh, still too raw to be named. They had walked away from the camp, from the handlers, from the dogs, and yet those years lived within them, not in the form of trauma, but in the quiet transformation that had taken place within their hearts. They carried it in the weight of their silence, in the gentleness of their touch, in the way they had learned to move through the world without the sharp edges of hate and fear that had once defined them. Aiko had once believed that survival meant holding on to everything she had lost. But what she had come to understand, after years of living in a country that had borne the weight of war's cruelty, was that survival was more than endurance. It was about learning to open herself up to compassion, to the soft presence of others, even when they had once been considered enemies. The dogs had been the first to show her that kindness could exist outside of violence, that care could heal what the world had broken. In those quiet moments of training, she had learned that survival meant learning to give and receive not through force, but through shared trust. And in that, there was a kind of quiet revolution taking place inside her, one that had taken root so deeply that it would never leave. The long-term impact of her time in captivity could not be measured by any physical wound. The psychological shifts were far subtler, embedded in the way she now moved through the world. There were days when the memories of the camp, the dogs, the handlers, would surface without warning, not as sharp images, but as sensations. The weight of a dog's head in her lap, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the quiet air of the training. Ah, yard! Those moments would return when she least expected it, in the quiet of the night or during a moment of rest. They would settle into her thoughts, like the slow, patient movements of the dogs, teaching her that there were things in this world that couldn't be fixed by power or politics, but only through small, quiet acts of care. In a country that had learned violence for so long, the most revolutionary act was not resistance, but the acceptance of peace in the smallest of things. The dogs had taught her how to heal. And in that lesson, Aiko realized she carried something far more powerful than the memories of war. She carried the quiet understanding that humanity could be reclaimed not through war, not through politics, but through simple, unspoken connection. This, in the end, was what the war had not been able to destroy, the human capacity to rebuild, not in spite of suffering, but because of it. It was a quiet revolution, one that Aiko carried with her every day, whether she realized it or not. If this story resonated with you, like the video and comment below where you're watching from, your engagement helps preserve these untold histories for the world.